In the early 13th century, from the windswept steppes of Central Asia emerged a name that would haunt civilizations from China to Europe, Genghis Khan. He rode at the head of an unstoppable force, an army of horsemen, archers, engineers, and assassins. They moved like shadows and struck like fire. Cities fell, empires crumbled, and entire cultures vanished. But it wasn't just military brilliance or overwhelming numbers that allowed Genghis Khan to forge the largest contiguous empire in human history. It was something more elemental, fear, not just the fear of death, but of something far worse, torture. Stories spread like wildfire across the known world, tales of nobles being crushed under heavy wooden boards, kings suffocated with thick felt blankets, soldiers burned alive in their own armor, ordinary people buried up to their necks and left for wild animals to find them. These weren't random acts of violence by angry soldiers. They were carefully planned tactics ordered by Genghis Khan himself. Each act of cruelty had a purpose: to make other cities so afraid that they would surrender without fighting. Before he became the Great Khan, he was just a boy named Temujin. Born around 1162 on the harsh Mongolian plains, his life started with tragedy. When he was only 9 years old, his father was poisoned by enemies. Overnight, his family became outcasts. They had to eat roots, mice, and sometimes their own horses just to survive. There was no safety anywhere. When Temujin was 15, rival tribes captured him. They put a heavy wooden collar around his neck that made it impossible to sleep or rest properly. He was paraded around like an animal. But young Temujin remembered every moment of that humiliation. When he finally escaped, he promised himself he would never be powerless again. As Temujin grew into a warrior, he learned that fear was more powerful than friendship. People might betray friends, but they rarely betrayed someone they were terrified of. When tribes refused to join him, he didn't just defeat them in battle. He made sure everyone knew what happened to those who said no. The Merkits, who had kidnapped his wife Bort, were completely destroyed. Their leaders were boiled alive in front of their own people. Others were burned slowly or cut into pieces. The message was clear: obey or suffer. In 1206, the Mongol tribes gathered by the Onon River and declared him Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler. By then, he had united a broken land through one simple rule: obey through fear. Torture wasn't just punishment anymore. It had become a tool of government, a language spoken with fire, rope, and blade. Genghis Khan didn't rule through chaos. He had strict laws called the Yasa. These laws covered everything from how to treat prisoners to how soldiers should behave. But at the heart of every law was one idea: loyalty to the Khan above everything else. Disobeying wasn't just crime, it was like insulting God himself. Stealing a horse meant being dragged behind one until you died. Lying could cost you your tongue. A soldier who ran from battle might see his whole family killed to remove the shame from his bloodline. For enemies of the empire, punishments were even worse. Spies were skinned alive, and their skin hung on city gates as warnings. Traitors were boiled in oil or killed slowly by being stabbed with wooden stakes. Sometimes entire royal families were buried alive or sealed inside towers to die in darkness. But there was logic to this cruelty. Genghis Khan believed that by punishing one person brutally, he could save the lives of thousands of others who would be too scared to fight back. When Genghis Khan surrounded a city, the real attack often began before any arrows were fired. It began with stories. Word traveled faster than horses about cities that had fought the Mongols and been completely destroyed. Stories of commanders who were tortured to death in front of their armies. Stories of mass graves so huge they changed the shape of the land itself. Before the first catapult was loaded, many cities were already crumbling under the weight of what they knew was coming. Fear, Genghis Khan understood, was more efficient than fighting. To make fear really work, it had to be seen and heard. It had to be passed from one terrified survivor to the next victim. When the city of Nishapur resisted in 1221, the consequences weren't quick. They were carefully planned. After a Mongol general was killed during the siege, Genghis Khan ordered every person in the city to be killed. But it wasn't just killing, it was sending a message. The Mongols stacked the skulls of the dead into giant pyramids at the city gates. Some say 100,000 people died, their bones piled as high as houses. It was a horrible monument that no traveler could ignore. The Mongols didn't hide what they did. They displayed it proudly. In other cities, captured soldiers were killed in organized ways. Each Mongol warrior had to kill exactly 24 prisoners. The executions took hours, but the message spread in seconds. Sometimes they didn't kill everyone. Important nobles were stripped naked, paraded through conquered cities, then tortured slowly. Some were blinded, others had parts of their bodies cut off, but they were kept alive as living warnings. Genghis Khan would deliberately spare one or two survivors, telling them to return home. These weren't acts of mercy, they were human messengers of fear. Survivors were forced to watch their loved ones die, their homes burn, their leaders tortured before being sent back. They returned not as heroes, but as broken people whose minds were scared with horror. One of the most symbolic punishments was death by crushing. This slow, suffocating execution was done by putting the victim between heavy wooden boards and piling stones on top until their chest caved in. This method was reserved for royalty and nobles. According to Mongol beliefs, spilling noble blood on the ground was forbidden, so they found ways to kill without cutting. The victim would be laid flat between thick wooden planks, and enormous weight would be applied until their ribs collapsed inward, crushing their lungs and heart. It was slow, silent, and deeply humiliating. Crowds were forced to watch as the condemned gasped for air, their faces turning purple as bones cracked. After conquering cities, the Mongols built monuments from human remains. These weren't random piles of bodies, but carefully constructed towers of skulls. In Nishapur, Merv, Herat, and Balkh, witnesses reported hills of human bones as high as buildings. Some were arranged in perfect geometric shapes, cones, domes, towers, as if the bones themselves had to serve some symbolic purpose. Each structure spoke without words to anyone who saw it. At Nishapur, after 100,000 people were killed, Persian writers said the bones were sorted by type. Men in one pile, women in another, children in a third. A tower of bones stood in the center. At Merv, so many people were executed that they ran out of space to bury them. Instead, they built bone mountains that could be seen from miles away. One traveler passing through decades later described how the sun reflected off the weather-whitened skulls like a field of ivory stones. In the vast, harsh landscapes of Central Asia and Persia, the Mongols turned nature itself into an executioner. One of their most psychologically devastating punishments was abandonment. Victims were stripped of clothes, water, and weapons, then taken deep into barren desert far from any village or water source. There they were left alone, confused, and exposed. Sometimes their hands were tied, other times they were left free to wander hopelessly toward a horizon that offered nothing. To die of thirst in the desert is not quick. The tongue swells, lips crack, and skin peels in the sun. The mind breaks before the body does. Victims often walked in circles, leaving footprints that formed haunting spirals in the sand. When the punishment was meant to send a particular message, they would bury traitors up to their necks, leaving them to die slowly under the sun, attacked by insects and animals. Fire was not just a weapon for the Mongols, it was a message, a ritual, and a punishment. When Genghis Khan decided a city must be completely destroyed, he unleashed destruction that felt like the end of the world. Mongol siege warfare was efficient. They used captured engineers to build catapults and flaming weapons. Once inside the walls, the strategy was brutal: kill those who resist, take valuable items, then burn everything. But this wasn't limited to buildings. People were burned too. In cities like Nishapur, Balkh, and Bamiyan, fires were set while people were still inside their homes. Entire neighborhoods were blocked off, covered with oil, and set on fire. Screams echoed through stone streets as flames spread faster than victims could run. There was no warning, no mercy, no escape. Survivors wrote about men, women, and children being herded into grain storage buildings or mosques, then locked inside as soldiers with torches surrounded the building. Fire was set on all sides while doors were barred shut. The people inside were reduced to ash and bone, their cries carried on the wind. Genghis Khan's greatest weapon wasn't his horse or his bow. It was fear itself. Long before Mongol armies arrived at city walls, they had already begun the battle, not with soldiers, but with stories. Tales of destroyed cities, pyramids of skulls, mass burnings, and ritual executions raced across trade routes like wildfire. By the time people heard these stories, the Mongols weren't just an army in their minds, they were an extinction event. The Mongols created fear with the same precision they used for military planning. Terror wasn't a side effect of conquest, it was part of the plan. After each massacre, Survivors were deliberately spared and sent to nearby cities with gruesome stories of what they had seen. These messengers of fear weren't accidental, they were tools of propaganda. When Genghis Khan conquered an empire, he didn't just kill soldiers, he killed entire family lines. The Mongols understood what many conquerors before them had missed. If you leave royal children alive, they grow up to become kings who want revenge. So they didn't leave them alive. From the steppes of Central Asia to the palaces of northern China, Genghis Khan's forces hunted down not only rulers, but their heirs' sons, nephews, grandsons of defeated emperors, and killed them in cold, methodical executions. Sometimes the killings were public, other times they were secret. But the goal was always the same, to end a bloodline permanently. In the city of Urgench, after a long siege, Mongol soldiers hunted down members of the royal family, dragging them from hiding places in temples, homes, and underground tunnels. Boys were killed immediately, their throats cut or suffocated with cloth. At Bamiyan, where one of Genghis Khan's beloved grandsons was killed in battle, the Khan's response was genocidal. The entire city was not only destroyed, it was wiped from history. Every member of the ruling class, including children, was executed. Even within their own ranks, the Mongols used torture to maintain discipline. The code of laws called the Yasa governed everything, and its punishments were unforgiving. A soldier who stole might be tied to a wooden post and beaten with whips for days. Those who deserted were sometimes dragged behind horses until their skins split and bones shattered. Others were tied to poles and left exposed to weather until death came from cold, heat, or wild animals. The survivors who lived to tell these stories left records that still survive today. Persian chroniclers, Chinese poets, and Syrian historians all wrote about the horror they witnessed. One chronicler described seeing 200,000 people executed in a single week, their blood running through the streets like a river. A Syrian historian wrote, "I wish I had died before living to see what I have seen." But despite all this cruelty, the Mongol Empire didn't disappear in shame. It endured, transformed, and eventually became part of the very civilizations it once destroyed. In Mongolia today, Genghis Khan is a national hero. His face appears on money, his statue towers over the plains he once rode. But to others, the Persians, Chinese, and Slavs, his legacy remains a wound. Genghis Khan built more than an empire, he built a machine of fear, a system that combined speed with savagery, discipline with destruction. His torture methods weren't random acts of cruelty, they were the operating system of conquest. Even now, centuries later, we dig up bones and read ancient chronicles, wondering how one man could ignite such destruction across half the earth. The answer is simple. He built a system where fear was the fuel, and as long as people remember these stories, Genghis Khan's shadow still rides on the wind.